The text came in at 9:23 on a Tuesday evening, and I was sitting on my back porch with a glass of sweet tea, going warm in my hand, listening to the last birds settle before dark. 3 words. Still thinking of you. I held the phone for a long time without moving. Anyone else in the world would have read that message and felt a small warmth and typed something back and moved on. Anyone else would have had no reason to stop, but I am not anyone else. And my sister Nora knew exactly what she was sending me. Because 26 years ago, the night before I shipped out for my second overseas deployment, we sat together in a worn-out diner off Route 25 outside Augusta, the kind of place with sticky menus and coffee that tasted like the pot hadn't been washed since the 90s. And I made her memorize a code. If she was okay, genuinely okay, she would text me, thinking of you. If she needed help but couldn't say so out loud, couldn't ask directly, couldn't let anyone nearby know she was asking, she would add one word. Still, that was the whole system. One syllable buried in ordinary language, invisible to anyone who didn't know it was there. I built it at a diner counter in 15 minutes because she was crying and I needed her to stop worrying about me. Neither of us ever used it. 26 years passed. I retired from the army, came home, planted a vegetable garden, adopted 2 dogs, and never once thought about that code again. Until that night, I set my tea on the railing and went inside. I want to tell you something before I go any further, because it matters. People imagine that military training makes you hard, cold. They picture some kind of emotional shutdown, a wall you construct between yourself and feeling. That is not what 20 years in uniform actually does. What it gives you is something more complicated and harder to name. A very specific relationship with fear. You learn to hold it at arm's length, to not let it make your decisions. You learn to feel it fully, and act anyway. That skill, more than anything else I learned while wearing a uniform, is what carried me through the next 3 weeks. And I want you to understand that when I recognized what that message meant, I was afraid, not panicked, but afraid. Because it is one thing to receive a distress signal from a soldier in the field, it is entirely another thing to receive one from your little sister. Nora Harlow Drummond now, after her marriage 7 years ago, is 4 years younger than me and has always been the kind of person who makes a room feel warmer just by walking into it. We grew up outside Augusta, daughters of a school teacher, and a quiet, bookish man who fixed refrigerators to pay the mortgage and read poetry on Sunday mornings without apology. I was the one who climbed fences and got into fights, and enlisted at 22. Nora was the one who mended the torn knees of my jeans and didn't tell our mother. She got a teaching certificate, moved to Savannah, and spent 15 years running the library at an elementary school, the kind of librarian that students actually remembered, the kind who read aloud with full voice acting, and stayed late to help the ones who struggled with letters. She was beloved, genuinely, deeply beloved. When I came home on leave, people who recognized her name would light up. I was so proud of her it felt like a physical thing. She married Dennis Drummond 7 years ago. I will admit I liked him at first. Most people did. Dennis was the kind of man who walked into a room and owned it without appearing to try. He was generous with attention, easy with laughter, charming in a way that felt almost effortless. He remembered the names of your parents and the details of your last conversation, and had a talent for making you feel, in the exact moment he was speaking to you, that you were the most interesting person in the room. I have encountered that quality before. In strong, secure leaders, it is genuinely wonderful. In controlling people, it is a tool. It took me longer than I will ever fully forgive myself, for to understand which kind Dennis was. The first signal I chose to rationalize came about 2 years into their marriage. I started noticing that Nora waited before answering questions. Not because she was thinking, because she was checking. I'd ask what she wanted for lunch, and she'd glance at Dennis first. I'd suggest a weekend visit, and she'd say she needed to look at the schedule, and then Dennis would answer. Little things. Easy to explain away. She was being considerate, I told myself. I was imagining things. I was being an overprotective older sister. I was not imagining things. The dismissals toward me started around year 3. They were never cruel enough to confront directly, just consistent. Maggie's always been the quiet type. She doesn't really understand business. She's a homebody, aren't you, Maggie? Said the way some people compliment a child warmly, just slightly over your head, with the implicit weight of someone who had measured you and found you harmless. I let it go every time. I should have let it irritate me more than it did. Because men who enjoy underestimating people don't usually reserve it for one person. By the time the text arrived, the erosion had been visible for 2 years. Nora had stopped calling first. Her messages grew shorter, then infrequent, then nearly absent. She canceled 4 visits in 6 months. Her social media, once full of book recommendations and photographs of her students' reading events and pictures from weekend drives, had gone completely silent. The last post was a photograph of the river with no caption. Nothing after that. And then, one Sunday afternoon while helping her organize the garage, I saw bruising near her wrist. She pulled her sleeve down before I'd finished my question. "Knocked it on a shelf," she said. The answer came too fast, too polished. I didn't push. You don't push a frightened person toward a door they haven't decided to open. You stay close, and you wait. I filed it away and kept watching and kept telling myself I was giving her the space she needed. That night, sitting in my kitchen with her message on my phone, I stopped giving myself that permission, because guilt is not useful in a crisis. Guilt slows you down. I put it aside the way I'd been trained to put aside every feeling that couldn't help me right now, and I went to work. The first rule of crisis response is simple. Do not let emotion drive the timeline. The second rule is everything. Gather facts before you move. I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen, and I built a picture. I scrolled back through 18 months of text messages. The pattern, once I was looking for it, was almost painfully clear. Nearly every phone call under 10 minutes. Nearly every visit canceled by Dennis, not Nora. Nearly every message ending in a way that felt unfinished, like a sentence cut off mid-breath. I wrote his name and underlined it several times. Then I called Carla Reyes. Carla lives 2 houses from Nora, retired pharmacist. Methodical, quiet, the kind of neighbor who notices everything and says nothing until asked. She picked up on the second ring. I heard the hesitation before she even spoke. That hesitation told me something. She said Nora hadn't driven herself anywhere in about 6 weeks. She said there had been shouting coming from the house. Kevin mostly, she said, then corrected herself. Dennis mostly, Nora mostly crying. She said the woman who cleaned the house twice a month had stopped coming around 3 weeks prior. Then, after a long pause, she said something that stayed with me. She'd seen Nora standing at the kitchen window very early one morning, standing completely still, not doing anything, just looking out. She said it stayed with her because it didn't look like someone standing at a window because they wanted to. It looked like someone who had nowhere else to go. I thanked her. I hung up. I sent a brief, friendly text to Dennis, thinking of stopping by tomorrow if that works. Hope you two are doing well. The reply came back in under a minute, too fast. Almost as though he'd been watching his phone. We're fine. 2 words. No mention of Nora by name. Not she'd love that, or Nora says hello, just, we're fine. The royal we of a man who had, without ever stating it aloud, come to believe that his wife was an extension of himself rather than a separate person. Control reveals itself in language. Almost every time. I wrote it down. It was past 10 when I picked up my keys. I didn't speed. Speed is for panic, and I was not panicking. I was operating, which is a very different state of being. My mind was running through what I knew and what I still needed to learn. I parked half a block away out of a habit I've never fully shed since leaving the army, and I walked the rest of the way in the dark. The lights in Nora's house were on downstairs and one window upstairs. I came around through the side yard. There is a narrow gap between the curtain panels in the living room window, and through it I could see a section of the room. Nora was on the couch. Her shoulders were moving. She was crying. Dennis was standing across the room with his arms crossed, watching her, not reaching for her, not speaking, just watching. Then he walked to the front door, checked the lock, turned it, checked it again. He walked away. I stood in the shadow of the hedge and took one slow breath. Some realizations don't arrive as surprises. They arrive as confirmations of something you already knew, but had spent too long hoping you were wrong about. I was not wrong. I knocked. Movement inside stopped instantly. The door opened and there was Dennis' shirt pressed even at 10 o'clock at night, that social smile already assembling itself. His eyes read me in under a second. Surprise. Calculation. Both things simultaneously, before the smile finished locking in. I told him I was in the area and wanted to check on Nora. He said she was tired. I said I was sure she could decide that for herself. The smile faltered. Just slightly. Just enough. Nora appeared in the hallway, and when she saw me standing there, What crossed her face wasn't surprise or ordinary relief. It was something rawer than that. It was the expression of someone who has been underwater for a very long time and has just broken the surface. She looked like she wanted to collapse. I noted the puffiness around her eyes, the way she could not hold Dennis's gaze for more than a heartbeat, the way her hands were clasped in front of her at a height that told me she had been holding herself together through sheer discipline for hours. I spent 20 minutes in their living room doing the most ordinary-sounding thing I could manage: weather, a mutual friend's recent move, a story about one of my dogs getting into the garden. The entire time I was watching Dennis, I watched him cut off every sentence Nora started. I watched him correct information that didn't require correcting. I watched him answer questions directed at his wife, as though she were not present. At one point, I asked Nora directly whether she was still doing the Wednesday morning reading group she'd mentioned months ago. Dennis answered before she'd fully opened her mouth. She'd stepped back from that, he said smoothly. Managing her energy, I held Nora's eyes. Do you miss it? She looked at her husband, then back at me, then at her hands. Yes, she said. Just the word. Quietly. The way you use a word that hasn't been spoken aloud in a while. When I stood to leave, I said I'd forgotten something in my car and asked if Nora would walk out with me. Dennis was on his feet in under a second. I shrugged and said I just wanted the company. Refusing would look strange, and Dennis was far too image-conscious to risk looking strange. We stepped outside. The night was humid and still. How bad is it? Her chin trembled. She opened her mouth, closed it, and said two words that carried years inside them. Oh God. I took her hand. He's hurting you. She started to shake her head. Then she stopped. Then, slowly, she nodded. Not every day, she whispered. But enough. The word enough landed like something physical. How long? She looked at the pavement. 2 years. 2 years sat on my chest and I breathed through it. Then I looked at her and I asked the only question that mattered. What do you need from me? She looked up. And I want you to understand what I saw on her face in that moment, because this is the heart of the story. The diminished woman who had been sitting on that couch all evening, the one with the rehearsed smile and the carefully managed answers, was gone. The Nora I grew up with was looking at me, the one who drove through a snowstorm to help me move. The one who organized book fairs and made an entire room laugh with one perfectly timed line. She was still there. She'd been there the whole time, waiting. I need a way out, she said. I squeezed her hand. You have one. I told her to start copying documents whenever she had access. Bank statements, insurance records, anything with both names on it. Photograph them. Send them to an account she could access from somewhere he couldn't monitor. Don't take originals. Don't change anything visible. Just copy. She nodded with a focus I hadn't seen on her face in years. Yes, she said, and it sounded like her own voice again. A car door slammed somewhere down the street and she flinched. I let go of her hand. She went back inside. I sat in my car in the dark for a while and did not let myself feel anything that would slow me down. What came next was 3 weeks of the most deliberate, disciplined work I'd done since leaving the army. Nora and I communicated through channels. Dennis couldn't monitor library digital loan confirmations with notes tucked into renewal requests, brief messages from a device kept at Carla's house next door, emails from a new account I set up on a cheap phone from a gas station. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic. 2 sisters using what they had. Meanwhile, I contacted an attorney, Sandra Ose, 60 years old, family law specialist based in Savannah, with a reputation for being genuinely fearless. When I described the situation by phone, she said, "Bring everything," and she'd tell me where we stood. The documents Nora sent over those 3 weeks were extraordinary. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were meticulous. Financial records going back 5 years. A savings account in both their names that Nora had never been told about carrying a balance of $183,000. 5 years of transfers between accounts that, laid end to end, painted a picture of deliberate, sustained concealment. Credit card statements showing Dennis spending on hotels and restaurant dinners in cities. He'd told Nora he visited for business during the same periods he'd told her they couldn't afford her arthritis specialist. Appointments? Couldn't afford the house cleaner whose help Nora genuinely needed. Couldn't afford the small freedoms she'd stopped asking about. And then, on the 16th day, Nora found a tablet left logged in a device she hadn't known the password to, and found 2 years of messages from another woman. Hotel receipts, photographs, The kind of evidence that doesn't require interpretation. Honestly, I wasn't shocked. Men like Dennis rarely restrict their deceptions to one area. They are comprehensive in it. What I felt was something colder than anger, something that focused rather than scattered. The understanding that we now had enough not just to leave, but to make sure he could not minimize it, reframe it, or charm his way through it. I want to pause here and say something directly, because I think it matters. During those 3 weeks, Nora gathered those documents with shaking hands in the intervals when Dennis was out of the house. She photographed bank statements while listening for his car in the driveway. She memorized the layout of his email app during the 20 seconds she had access to a screen. She did this while living with someone who had spent 2 years teaching her that her instincts couldn't be trusted, that she was dependent, that she needed him to function. If you have ever been made to feel that way about yourself by someone who claimed to love you, if you know the specific exhaustion of performing normalcy every single day, while something inside you is asking to be let out, then you know what that kind of courage costs. It is not the loud kind of courage. It doesn't look impressive from the outside. But I have stood beside soldiers in difficult terrain, and I am telling you honestly, what my sister did in those 3 weeks was as brave as anything I have ever witnessed. Sandra reviewed the full file over 2 meetings. At the end of the second one, she removed her reading glasses and sat back and said, "He has no idea what's coming." She meant it professionally. I felt it in a way that was much more personal. One evening during the 3rd week, Nora called me from a parking lot. She asked whether I had ever been afraid in the army. I told her yes. Every person with good judgment gets afraid. She asked what the difference was between a person who froze and one who didn't. I looked out my kitchen window. The sunset was orange across the tree line. The difference, I told her, is that the fear doesn't get the final vote. She went quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I think I'm ready." I said, "I know." Dennis's 57th birthday party was held at a restored riverfront warehouse in Savannah, the kind of converted industrial space with polished concrete floors and exposed brick and lighting, calibrated to make everyone look more successful than they felt. He had invited 60 or 70 people, business associates, neighbors, former colleagues, old friends. He was in his element entirely. I watched him from across the room for 20 minutes before anything happened, and I will give him this. The performance was genuinely impressive. He moved through the crowd with ease, giving each person just enough attention to make them feel seen, telling stories that landed, laughing at the right moments. I understood, watching him, how people were taken in. I understood how Nora had been. He was very good at this. He had spent decades practicing. Then Sandra entered the room. She wore a charcoal blazer and carried a slim leather folder and moved through the crowd the way people do when they have done this many times, and carry no anxiety about it whatsoever. Dennis saw her from across the room. I watched the confusion cross his face, then the wariness, then something close to fear, that he controlled almost before it arrived. He looked at me. I held his gaze and did not look away first. Nora was standing beside him when Sandra reached them. He reached out a hand to shake, still performing, still calibrating, and Sandra did not take it. She addressed Nora by name. Nora reached into her bag and produced the documents, organized and flagged, and extended them to her husband with both hands. "I want you to sit with this image for a moment." The woman who had whispered in the dark outside her own house 3 weeks earlier, who had said, "Oh, God," in a voice stripped down to nothing, stood in a room full of her husband's admirers and handed him the full documentation of his own exposure without trembling. Her hands were steady. Her face was calm. The old Nora, the brave one. The real one had come all the way back. The room went quiet in stages. The way crowds do when they realize something real is happening. Not performed real, actually real. Dennis looked at the papers for a long time. Nobody spoke. The jazz playing from a speaker in the corner suddenly seemed very loud and very wrong. He looked up at Nora and his face had lost the architecture that held all his expressions in order. What was underneath was smaller than I expected. Diminished. He said no, just that one word, barely audible. Then again, louder. No. He set the papers on a table and looked at them, and looked at Nora, and said, "You can't do this." And Nora said, without any drama whatsoever, without raising her voice, without needing anyone in that room to validate what she already knew. "I already have." 4 words, the quietest, most complete sentence I had ever heard her speak. I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't known was clenched. He stepped toward her, the old pattern returning the pressure, the weight of him moving into her space to make her smaller. She didn't move. She stood and looked at him directly, and he stopped. Because the thing about control built on manufactured helplessness is that it only works on someone who still believes the story. Nora had stopped believing it. She knew her own capabilities now. She had the documents and the attorney and the exit plan, and the knowledge that she had built all of it while he wasn't watching. The look on his face in that moment was almost painful to observe, not because I felt sorry for him, but because he genuinely couldn't understand what he was seeing. He had spent years reshaping her, and the reshaping had not held. Then he found me across the room. He walked toward me with his jaw set and his eyes bright with the particular fury of someone who has just realized the story they were living is not the story everyone else was watching. He stopped a few feet away. "Several people nearby were watching," he said. "Who exactly do you think you are?" I held his gaze. I let the silence sit for one full second. Then I said, "The quiet, retiring older sister you spent 7 years dismissing." His mouth opened slightly. Nothing came out. I said, "That was your first mistake, and your most expensive one." The room was still. The jazz from the corner speaker felt very far away. Dennis stood there for a moment in a silence that had a specific quality, the silence of someone hearing the floor fall out from under a story they had told themselves for years. Then he walked out. Not gracefully, not with composure. He walked out the way people do when they have no performance left. The legal proceedings took 4 months. There were difficult stretches, attempts to minimize, to reframe, to make the financial records appear to be misunderstandings. Sandra Osei does not accept reframings when she has receipts. The hidden account was documented. The 5 years of transfers were documented. The affair was documented. The pattern of isolation and controlled access, no independent finances, no unsupervised driving, no social contact, not monitored by Dennis, was documented. Facts are not negotiable. Facts simply are. Nora moved into a riverfront apartment in Savannah 6 weeks after the party. The first Sunday I visited, she was on her balcony with a book open in her lap and a cup of coffee going cold beside her, the way it always went cold when she got absorbed in reading, the way it had gone cold for 15 years before Dennis, the way it was going cold again now. She looked up when she heard my footsteps, and I want to tell you what her face looked like. Because it's the reason I'm telling you this story at all. She looked like herself. Not a monitored version or a managed version or a rehearsed version. Herself. The ease was back. The laugh lines were back. The color was back. She looked like someone who had walked a very long distance and had finally, been allowed to sit down. We talked for hours. At one point, she asked me when I had first suspected something was wrong. I told her the truth. Years before I said anything. She looked at me and said, "You should have told me." I shook my head. "People leave when they're ready," I told her. "You cannot push someone through a door they haven't decided to open yet. The most useful thing I could do was to be someone you trusted enough to reach when you were ready." She was quiet for a while, looking at the river. Then she said, "He had me convinced I had no options." And I said, "I know, that was exactly what he needed you to believe." She wiped her eyes and laughed a little through it. "He had no idea who he was dealing with." "No," I said. "Neither did I, actually. Because you are stronger than either of us knew." There is a question I kept asking myself for a long time after all of this was over. Not why didn't I act sooner, I made peace with that eventually. The question that actually kept me up at night was this: how many times did I sit across from Nora at a Sunday lunch and look at her face and decide that what I was seeing was her rather than what someone had made of her? That question doesn't have a clean answer, and I've stopped needing one. What I know is this: when someone spends years systematically narrowing your world, taking your keys, your bank account, your housekeeper, your Wednesday mornings, your friendships, they are not destroying you. They are building a version of you that is easier to manage, smaller, more dependent, more believable to yourself, as someone who cannot cope without them. The cruelty is not in the taking. It is in how long it takes you to notice that something is missing. Nora told me something the last time we talked before I started writing this. She said, "The strangest part wasn't leaving. It was realizing I'd forgotten what I was like before I started shrinking." I sat with that for a long time. I'm still sitting with it now. Because I think a lot of people watching this know exactly what she means, and some of them are not in the situation Nora was in. Some of them are somewhere in the middle, still telling themselves it isn't that bad. Still giving the benefit of the doubt. Still translating someone else's behavior into something they can live with. If that's you tonight, I'm not going to give you a list of things to do. I'm just going to ask you one question, and I want you to sit with it honestly. When was the last time you made a decision, a real one? Something that actually mattered without first calculating how someone else would react to it? You don't have to answer that out loud. But if the answer surprised you, it might be worth paying attention to. I've been making this channel for a while now, and the comments that stay with me the longest are never the ones that say great story. They're the ones that say I didn't realize until right now. If this story was that for you in any way, large or small, I'd genuinely like to know. Not with a number. Just tell me what it brought up, what it reminded you of, what you're going to do with it. I'm going to read everything. That is not something I say as a formality. And if you're somewhere outside the United States right now, if you're watching this in the early hours of a Tuesday in a city I've never visited, I want to hear that too. There's something about knowing where people are when they encounter a story that has always felt important to me. So tell me where you are and what it's like outside your window. One last thing. The coded message Nora sent me. Still thinking of you took her 2 years to send. 2 years of waiting until she believed someone would come. I want the people watching this to know. You don't have to wait 2 years. You don't have to have a code. You don't have to have a sister who spent 20 years in the army. You just have to tell one person that the answer to how are you is not actually fine. That's the whole message. That's the only code that matters. If you want more stories like this one about people who found their way through the quiet kinds of hard, subscribe. We're here every week. We're not going anywhere. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Savannah, Georgia to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.